Welcome everyone to another Second Opinion review. Today, we're taking a look at a game from my childhood, which was one of the earlier games I got for the original PlayStation. While this is the second game ever created by Insomniac Games, it's their first breakout success, cementing them as one of Sony's leading developers for over the next 15 years. This week, we're looking at the first Spyro the Dragon game. As previously stated, Spyro the Dragon was created by Insomniac Games. It was published by Sony Computer Entertainment and was released in North America on September 10th, 1998. It might be hard to tell from the title, but the game stars a young dragon who goes by the name of Spyro. You might remember having seen him once or twice, as he's easily recognizable thanks to his vibrant, purple scales. Spyro the Dragon is a 3D platformer from the days when this genre was king. Everyone back in the late 90s was creating 3D mascot platformers, but few rose to the top. Spyro was one that did. The plot for Spyro the Dragon is fairly simple. Nasty Nork and the dragons have been living somewhat peacefully for years, until one day, one of the dragons decides it'd be a great idea to insult Mr. Nork on live television. Well, he doesn't take kindly to the mud being slung his way, and decides to take action, encasing all of the dragons in crystal. Spyro just so happens to be the only small, young dragon in the land for some reason, so he ends up being overlooked. It's now up to him and his dragonfly buddy Sparks to defeat Mr. Nork's invading armies, and free all of the dragons from each realm. So how is this translated into the design of the game? Let's take a look. Design-wise, this game isn't terribly complicated. Being a 3D platformer from the late 90s, you spend a lot of time exploring open level designs that you enter through a hub world, and you collect tons of different knickknacks along the way. Mr. Nork's minions have stolen all of the dragon's treasure, giving a large chunk of it to Nasty, but also keeping a bit for themselves. However, the vast majority of it was carelessly dropped practically everywhere, leaving Spyro with the task of picking it all up. Each level has a specific amount of treasure that you must find if you want 100% completion. Along with treasure, you're also tasked with finding all of the stolen dragon eggs, and freeing all of the adult dragons from crystal. Freeing the dragons is as simple as stepping on the platform they're frozen on. Grabbing the eggs is a bit more complex, and requires finding the thief who stole it before giving chase and running them down. It's strange that these eggs stop appearing after the Magic Crafter's world, however, as if it was an afterthought in the design. It works well, but I wish there was more of it. That's about as deep as the base design for the game's level goals gets. The levels themselves usually begin with a fairly linear structure gently guiding you through to the end, but as you explore each level, side paths begin to open up quite often. Many of these paths overlap sections of the level you've previously explored, leading to most levels feeling much less linear than they did when you began. It's an interesting way of all but guaranteeing that the player gets the minimum amount of dragons, eggs, or gems needed to get to the next world, while still making the levels feel free and open. As for how you traverse these levels, Spyro's controls are pretty simple, while still being kinda unique. Being a dragon, Spyro can breathe fire. This is your basic attack, and has a range that extends about as long as Spyro's body is. Spyro can also make use of his large dragon horns, in the form of a dash attack. This dash attack can be held indefinitely as long as you don't hit a particularly solid object. It speeds Spyro up, and mows down enemies along the way. Spyro's jump is pretty normal, though pressing the button again while in the air allows him to glide. Similar to Knuckles, Spyro can fly around, though he slowly descends as he goes. Pressing triangle during a glide drops Spyro on the spot, which can be used as an effective way to precisely glide to a particularly small platform. And honestly, there's not much more to his controls. The design as a whole is not that complex, and I don't really think it needs to be. To begin, let's get this out of the way. Spyro is not a difficult game. It's not even a long game. Anyone who's played games somewhat regularly can likely beat Spyro without too much trouble, and in probably around 5 hours their first time. Completing the game 100% will be a bit more challenging, and can effectively double the playtime until you've learned the levels. There are plenty of cleverly hidden secrets in this game that require a bit of thinking and a very keen eye. But once you've played the game a couple times, you can get everything done within around 4 hours. While playing, Spyro will eventually encounter bosses, with one being in each world. These bosses are generally a disappointment, with none of them really challenging any of Spyro's core skills much. I like the designs and the ideas, but I think they'd be much more effective in another game with a different control scheme. Along with the boss levels, there are also flight levels, one in each world, which are effectively timed races to collect or interact with 4 groups of 10 items. In these levels, Spyro can actually fly rather than just glide, giving the player full 3D control of the young dragon, similar to flying a plane. These levels gave me such trouble when I was younger, thanks to the difficulty. Touching the water once instantly ends your run, and many of the objects can be found in tight spots, just inches from a cold, damp end. Hitting objects and walls at weird angles can often cause Spyro to kind of crash, sending him plummeting towards the water. One only needs to tap X to get him to start flying again, though there is a small window where this command will be ignored. Crash too low, and your run is definitely over. The other issue is how extreme the timer is. On average, you start with about 30 seconds at the beginning of a stage, but that quickly ticks down as you go. Each item you collect gives you some time, with more difficult items giving you more time. But it's still going to be a really, really close race. Honestly, these levels aren't too difficult these days. I used to despise them, but I'm competent enough now that they don't really bother me. I honestly kinda like them now, and they're a good diversion so that you're not doing the same exact thing for hours on end. There are a few mechanics worth noting that definitely spice things up in the normal levels, however. First up are the different types of enemies that Mr. Nork leaves out for Spyro. Spyro effectively breaks its enemies down into 3 different camps. There are small enemies that can be flamed or dashed through, there are enemies with fire-resistant armor requiring a dash, and there are enemies who are so big that only flames will work against them. Technically, there are also enemies who have both armor and are too big to be dashed. These enemies can be taken down in a few ways depending on the level. Some require waiting until they expose their unarmored back. Others need to be dashed into repeatedly until they're pushed off a cliff, etc. Enemies in general in Spyro can often be found working together too. One example is a large enemy who can't be dashed through, that sends small armored enemies rushing toward young Spyro. So the player is tasked with getting through both armored enemies with a dash before stopping at the feet of the larger enemy to thrash it with flames. Go too slow, input the incorrect command, or if you're just generally sloppy with your inputs, and you're probably going to take a hit. This type of design keeps the rather simple enemies fresh by giving them unique patterns to overcome. If you do take a hit, luckily Spyro has Sparks to protect him. Sparks effectively takes the damage for Spyro. He goes from a bright gold, to a mellow blue, to a fresh green, before finally disappearing. If you take a hit when Sparks is gone, you die. There are also some instant kill planes in the game as well. Interestingly enough, Sparks also collects gems for you when you're nearby them, but if he's gone, Spyro has to collect them themselves. It's a nice little touch. Getting back health and bringing Sparks back from the dead requires finding little innocent animals in each stage and flame breathing them or dashing them. If you have no Sparks left, you'll immediately get him back. If you do have Sparks, it'll take him a second or two to chase down the butterfly that comes out of each of these little critters. Once he eats it, then you get your health back. The next thing we'll look at are dash pads. Dash down a dash pad, and Spyro will enter some sort of super dash state. This state can allow Spyro to reach normally unreachable areas. It can allow him to dash through enemies and obstacles that are normally indestructible, and it can be stacked using multiple dash pads, giving Spyro even more distance when he jumps off things like ramps. These pads are only used in a handful of levels, but darn they're fun. Precision is required for some things the game wants you to use them for, but it shouldn't be impossibly difficult for most people. Next up is Super Breath. If I recall, this mechanic is only used in 1 or 2 levels. When kissed by a fairy, Spyro gains deep red fire breath that can burn through even the most heavily armored of enemies and doors. It only lasts for a certain amount of time and distance though. Finally, there are a bunch of miscellaneous mechanics, like cannons that you can aim at enemies and fire, tents that enemies can hide in, and enemies that can alter the environment. Each of these little things is only used a handful of times, or at most during a single world. But they offer a wealth of variety that really allows the player to feel like they're coming up with ingenious solutions to problems, even when they're doing exactly what the designers intended. The presentation in Spyro is excellent for its time. As I've mentioned in previous videos, PlayStation 1 games are notorious for having some pretty nasty tearing and warping. Spyro suffers from this issue just like any other, but it's thankfully to an extremely minimal degree. I've heard several times over the years that Insomniac and Naughty Dog helped pioneer the common use of different LODs, or levels of detail, in game design. Basically, they supposedly were some of the first to create several different versions of a 3D model in big budget games, as a way to save on resources. Some of you might not realize, but as you get further away from objects in games, they're usually replaced with a less detailed version, so as to reallocate those resources to something more pertinent. If you can't see the details of an object from so far away, there's no reason for it to be so detailed. That's the basic idea. I couldn't seem to find any information proving that Naughty Dog and Insomniac were pioneers of using this technology in AAA games, so take it however you will. Regardless, this game is absolutely beautiful, and has some extraordinarily unique and interesting environments. While each world has an overarching theme, each level feels like its own thing within that theme, and really keeps the player excited for what's coming next. As far as the story goes, you might be asking why I kept calling Nasty Nork Mr. Nork earlier in the review. Well, that's because I have a feeling he's actually the good guy here. Wait, hear me out. Mr. Nork was honestly just minding his own business. It's the dragons who are the bad guys here.
Nasty Nork is a simple creature. Simple! He has been contained in a remote world and is no threat to the Dragon Kingdom. No threat! Besides, he is ugly. That does it!
Looks like I've got some things to do.
They're just as arrogant as he is, as shown by the first cutscene. They've taken up all the space and forced the Norks to live in a single polluted and cramped realm. They're the ones who treated Mr. Nork like dirt, calling him names, making fun of him, and basically begging for him to retaliate. He may have made some mistakes, but he was only defending himself. What, so you still think the dragons are the good guys? Why do so many of the dragons try to indoctrinate Spyro by telling him that Mr. Nork is evil? Why do they ignore the fact that they're the ones that caused all of this? Plus, why don't any of the freed adult dragons help Spyro or even do the job for him? He's just a kid after all. They obviously care little for anybody but themselves. That's why Spyro is the only young dragon left other than the unborn eggs you're collecting. That's why they've pushed the Norks into effectively an overpopulated slum. That's why they rely on scare tactics through the use of propaganda, claiming that Mr. Nork can somehow turn gems into other Norks, used for some phantom army he's building. That's why none of them lift a finger to help Spyro. I think the dragons are evil, and Mr. Nork, while not an upstanding citizen, is arguably justified in his actions. Or not. This story is honestly just fine. It's a little silly and doesn't always make sense, but it's fine. Awkward motivation and plot holes aside, it's simple, and it doesn't try to overstay its welcome. They set up the goal, and then they let you go. Perfect for a 3D platformer focused on gameplay. Finally, we'll talk about the music, which is amazing. I absolutely love this soundtrack. Stuart Copeland, the drummer for The Police, is actually the man behind this soundtrack, and he did an excellent job here. It's difficult to describe why this music works so well, but it just sort of does. There's a lot of subtlety in the seemingly simple song structures used here. Say that 5 times fast. There's a lot of depth and complexity in this soundtrack, and it's truly a must-listen recommendation for me.
Thank you for releasing me. Thank you for releasing me.
Thank you for releasing me.
Oh, thank you for releasing me.
Thanks for releasing me. Yeah, that got a bit obnoxious. They probably should have scripted in a few more jokes, because some of the ones that they do have are just great. It's a shame that they're so few and far between. Other than that, I can't really think of anything to improve on that isn't just a nitpick. This is a really well-designed game that genuinely knows how to stay within its simple boundaries, while exploring them to their fullest. And any of the control mistakes it does make are basically rectified in the later games. It may not push the larger envelope for 3D platformers a lot, but it certainly pushed its own envelope more than enough. I'm starting to sound redundant here, but Spyro the Dragon is a great game. It's full of life, content, and fun. It's interesting, and doesn't ask more from you than you really want to give it. The game doesn't waste your time with filler, and instead just asks that you enjoy yourself. This is a game every fan of 3D platformers really should try, as if most of you haven't already. Anyway, tell me about your experiences with Spyro 1 in the comments below. Subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and maybe check out some of the other videos I have on offer. Thanks for your time, and see you again soon!